It's an excellent graph. I'm like 99% sure. It's been a while since I've taken French, but I'm pretty sure. I am impressed that you're learning French though. French is a good language. All right, cool. Yep. Let's get either over 50 or to 905, and then let's start with some good old Wittgenstein. When it would be good to have John with me, so we could really get the German pronunciation of Wittgenstein. I'm doing my best attempt right now, but I only speak a couple words of German, so wish I spoke more. All right. Before we start, as always, those of you who haven't been doing the homework, you should do the homework. Those of you who haven't been posting on Reddit, which is almost all of you, consider posting on Reddit, getting a conversation going. Sophie is still holding down the fort. She's still posting. So good on you, Sophie. Everyone else needs to imitate Sophie and being an excellent student. All right. 2 more people. Either 2 more people or 1 more minute. Oh, there we go. Still stuck in Kant's time and space. Well, according to Kant, we're all stuck in time and space. So you're not the only one. On the other hand, if you mean you're still having trouble with Kant, that's understandable. All right. So that's 54 people. It's 9:05. Let's begin. All right. So everyone can see my screen. Daja Nung. Oh man, I forgot how to say "see" in Chinese. Ooh, this is bad. All right. Well, um, I'll look that up. I'll look that up over the break. All right. So today we'll be talking about Ludwig Wittgenstein. So as always, or as recently, we have our introduction, our biography, our historical background, philosophy, background to philosophy, philosophical investigations, one of Wittgenstein's 2 great works. So who was Ludwig Wittgenstein? What was his life like? What were the historical circumstances that affected him? What did he believe? How did he come to what he believed? And how did he argue? So, introduction. Why are we talking about Wittgenstein? So he's probably the most interesting philosopher we'll read about in this entire course. He was brilliant. He had 2 great works, one published during his life, one published after. They both were enormously impactful on philosophy, and they were completely opposed to each other. It's a singular and very strange achievement for one man to influence philosophy so much with 2 works that completely disagreed with each other. It's very weird. And that's not the only reason he's weird. He also has a very strange and interesting life. Um, I've actually spent quite a few slides on Wittgenstein's life because I find it so interesting. I think it is by far the most interesting life of any philosopher I've read about, and certainly any that we'll cover in this course. So yeah, I hope you guys find it as interesting as I do. So why are we talking about him? Yeah, in contrast to Kant, who had a very boring life. So why are we talking about Wittgenstein? Because he's very interesting, very influential. And the reason why he's in How We Know, or How to Think, is because he's a philosopher of language. He talks all about how to use language, how we actually use language, what language means. So you'll see it has a big impact on the idea of how to make an argument. Let's start off with the biography, though. So here we have Wittgenstein on the right. So he was born to a Jewish industrial family in Austria, 1889. That's two separate things. So they owned a lot of industry, and they were also Jewish. His family was one of the wealthiest in Europe, a fact which defined Wittgenstein's life. And we'll see exactly how, but the biggest is Wittgenstein never ever had to work. There was never any reason for him to have a job because he was enormously wealthy and his family was enormously wealthy. So in Wittgenstein's family, there were 9 children, all raised Catholic. Austria at the time wasn't super friendly towards Jews, and his family wanted to assimilate. They wanted to fit into the rest of Austria. Karl Wittgenstein, the father of the family, the patriarch, was an incredibly harsh and demanding man, and really, really asked a lot from his children. And he didn't allow Ludwig to go to a normal school until age 14. Until then, it was only private teachers, which of course they could afford. So as part of him being harsh and demanding, so 9 children, 5 boys, 4 girls. Of the 5 boys, 3 of them committed suicide. So 3 out of 5 of Karl Wittgenstein's sons committed suicide. Of course, you can't blame that all on Karl Wittgenstein, but like still, that's a pretty incredible statistic. So it wasn't he didn't teach Ludwig, by the way. It was only private teachers. He didn't go to normal school. He just had private teachers all the time. So when he did go to normal school, as you might expect, he didn't fit in well. He was seen as a sensitive and effeminate. Effeminate means he behaved like a girl. In Austria, it's very tough, very manly. Behaving like a girl, you're going to get made fun of. Also, strangely enough, another student in his high school was Adolf Hitler, who I presume I don't have to tell you exactly who that was. So because one of his classmates was Adolf Hitler, and because Wittgenstein was bullied, people have speculated in the past, they've wondered if Hitler learned his anti-Semitism, if he learned to hate Jews, because of Wittgenstein, because he bullied Wittgenstein. This seems really unlikely because Wittgenstein at this time said he was Catholic. He introduced himself as a Catholic. Everyone knew him as a Catholic. So it seems unlikely that Adolf Hitler even knew that Wittgenstein was Jewish. On a side note, part of this being raised Catholic, Wittgenstein, as he got older, absolutely hated the fact that he was Jewish. He said he would blame it on his lack of originality. So whenever he couldn't come up with what he thought was original philosophy, he'd say, it's because I'm Jewish. But as we'll find out, Wittgenstein was an unhappy man in general. So it's unsurprising he found a way of hating himself. So, onwards. So Wittgenstein graduates from high school and came into university as an engineer, but lost interest in it. He was a good engineer, but he didn't think it was that interesting. So then he came to Cambridge, so came out of Austria to England, to Cambridge, in part due to his admiration of Russell's mathematics. This is, of course, the same Russell that we've been reading. He attended Russell's lectures, and Russell, who first saw him as an annoyance because of his outspokenness, soon saw him as a genius. This is Bertrand Russell, in case you ever, as an old man, in case you ever wondered what he looked like. And there's actually a great story of Russell and Wittgenstein during university. Russell was very fond of Wittgenstein. He thought he was very strange, but he liked him quite a bit. And there's a great story that Russell tells where early on in their acquaintanceship, Russell doesn't know that Wittgenstein is a genius yet. So Wittgenstein goes up to him and says, "Am I an idiot? Should I just give up philosophy completely and only be an engineer?" And Russell, being a philosopher, says, "Okay, well, let's test this. You should write a philosophical paper, and I'll tell you whether to give up philosophy or not." So Wittgenstein goes off, writes a paper, comes back. Russell reads the first sentence and says, "You must not be an engineer. You must be a philosopher." So from that first sentence of Wittgenstein's paper, Russell instantly knows that Wittgenstein is going to be a great philosopher. So pretty cool, right? To have such a great man instantly recognize you as a genius. If only, if only. All right. So Karl Wittgenstein dies in 1913, and because he receives an inheritance, Ludwig instantly becomes one of the wealthiest men in Europe. Ludwig, still studying, still in college, for some reason, just leaves. He leaves Cambridge, goes to Norway, and then he's interested in Soren Kierkegaard, who's a philosopher who we'll cover later as part of existentialism. So he goes to Norway, he learns Norwegian and Danish, which are not easy languages. So it's not an easy task to learn Norwegian or Danish, but Wittgenstein does it anyways, and writes his notes on logic. Wittgenstein tries to submit notes on logic as sufficient for a bachelor's degree, but he's denied because he hasn't finished his classes. And just as if you today, went off to Norway and tried to submit a book instead of finishing out your classes, they wouldn't allow you. So Wittgenstein, on the other hand, is furious and he's heartbroken, and he can't believe that they won't allow him to get his college degree because he's written a philosophical book. So, 1913, Europe. You guys should know from your Western history what's about to happen. World War I, right? So, before I continue, is everyone clear on Wittgenstein's life so far? All right, great. So World War One. So it's 1913. Wittgenstein has just been denied his college degree. So World War One breaks out, and Ludwig volunteers. He's one of the wealthiest men in Europe. No reason for him to go into the army, but he does it anyways. He volunteers and is actually very brave, earns a lot of medals, is a great soldier, loves the life. Um, in 1918, he leaves the army, takes a leave of absence rather, which means he temporarily leaves the army, and writes his first great philosophical work, um, Tracticus. Uh, so then he comes back to the front after writing his first great philosophical work, gets captured, and spends 9 months in an Italian prisoner of war camp, which isn't particularly fun, as you might imagine. He's a captured soldier. And then he returns to his family at the end of the war. And Wittgenstein, who's not the most stable person in the first place, after 9 months as a prisoner, is suicidal and he's disillusioned. He gives all of his fortune to his siblings and decides to become an elementary school teacher. So just to be clear about how weird this is, Wittgenstein, one of the most wealthy men in Europe, who's just finished writing one of the greatest philosophical works of the 20th century. Of course, people don't know that yet, but at least Russell knows that Wittgenstein is brilliant. So he's incredibly wealthy. He's incredibly brilliant. He has many medals from the war, and now he's going to become an elementary school teacher. Like, it's really weird. Why is he becoming an elementary school teacher? What does that have to do with anything? I don't know, but he does. And this is him with his elementary school class. This is Wittgenstein, and these are all his, the little boys and little girls he's teaching. So, unfortunately, well, you'd think he loved philosophy and knowledge more than money, but then why elementary school, right? Why not high school at the very least? Or, try to get a degree so he could teach university. So as a school teacher, though, as you might expect from someone who is, sort of not very stable at the best and has just spent time in one of the worst wars in human history, he's really not a good school teacher. He's an absolute horror, actually. He canes the boys, pulls the hair of the girls, and insults the schoolmaster. So that's pretty much how he teaches. He's he's just mean to all the kids, and he's mean to everyone else at the school. So during this time, while he's serving as a school teacher, he publishes Tracticus, and it's published with an introduction by Russell. And so Bertrand Russell at this point is a very famous man. So a philosophical work that's published with an introduction by Russell is instantly going to be regarded as an important work. Wittgenstein being Wittgenstein, he says, Russell misunderstood me completely, and he tries to remove Russell's introduction from it. The publisher, of course, refuses because, almost no one gets Russell's name on their book, and that's going to help it sell, that's going to make it famous. Like the book without Russell's name would have just disappeared. So, again, why is Wittgenstein trying to remove Russell's name? It's sort of hard to figure out. So then in 1926, Wittgenstein is teaching, he's still a school teacher, and he's teaching in a small village in rural Austria. So this isn't the village, but this is rural Austria, so it might look something like this. When he gets mad at a boy for answering a question slowly, and he hits him so hard on the head that the boy collapses. So even during that time, that's really not acceptable for a grown man to hit a kid so hard that the kid collapses. So Wittgenstein flees the town and is not charged, probably because his family comes in and pays off everyone to convince them not to seek criminal charges. So that ends Wittgenstein's career as a school teacher. He ends it with narrowly escaping criminal charges. So he then goes to work as a gardener in Austria. And again, now that he's published Tracticus, he's becoming famous as one of like the best philosophers of his time. Russell's introduction helps it become famous. People read it, people realize it's brilliant. So people are thinking he's one of the best philosophers of his time. He's still incredibly wealthy. He still has more money than almost anyone else. And now he's working as a gardener. So he goes to work as a gardener. And while he's working as a gardener, I'm sorry, I don't actually know the Chinese word for gardener. So might be, if you guys don't know what that is, might be a good one to look up. But he takes care of plants. So while he's working as a gardener, okay, yeah, thank you. His sister invites him to design her townhouse. So invites him to design her house. And I think she's just sort of like, what is my brother doing? You know, he's brilliant. He shouldn't be working as a gardener. This is really silly. Like, let me give him something to do. So Wittgenstein takes the job very seriously and decides to create a house of perfect proportion, geometric perfection, spending a year to design the radiators and a year to design the door handles. So this is the house in terms of geometric perfection. You can see how it's all perfectly proportional. Everything's proportional. Also, really high ceilings. Look at that guy in proportion to this ceiling. So this is what that entire house is like. So as the story goes, so Wittgenstein designs it, but he has to have a construction worker. You know, he has to have someone who actually knows how to build a house, build it. So once it's almost completed, Wittgenstein forces the architect to raise the ceiling by 30 millimeters. So it had the exact proportions he wanted. And of course the architect is like, are you serious? Like, do you know how hard it'll be to like raise the ceiling like of an almost completed house, and you're asking me to raise it by 30 millimeters? But Wittgenstein forces him to, so he does. And by the way, in terms of these windows, so these windows, they don't have curtains. Instead, they have metal sheets which come down, and they're 150 kilograms. And the only way to raise them up was by pulleys, which Wittgenstein designed. So yeah, that's Wittgenstein as an architect. Unfortunately, the house no longer exists. But a lot has been written about it. It's an interesting place. So, Wittgenstein, I guess, gets tired of being a gardener, and he gives up manual labor. He still doesn't have a college degree, but he's appointed a lecturer at Cambridge in 1929 on the strength of his great philosophical work Tracticus, the support of Bertrand Russell and G.E. Moore, who we'll cover in a bit. And so this is pretty incredible, right? He's a lecturer at Cambridge and he doesn't have a college degree. So in 1938, Wittgenstein is spending time at Cambridge. He's a lecturer. The Nazis take over Austria, and Wittgenstein's family money is confiscated. So all of a sudden, his almost all of his family money is gone because the Nazis take it all. Presumably, they managed to hide some, but still, you can imagine that's a pretty big blow to such a wealthy family. The year after, in 1939, Wittgenstein becomes a full professor at Cambridge, and he gains a reputation as a brilliant and strange philosopher. So now he's a full professor at Cambridge, still doesn't have a college degree. So as part of him being brilliant and strange, after each class, he would apparently run off to the cinema to watch a Western. So, a cowboy movie. And also one very famous student of his is Alan Turing, who we've talked about before, and who you might know from the recent movie, The Imitation Game. And Alan Turing thought Wittgenstein was very, very strange. And he actually said that later on. All right. And then to end Wittgenstein's life, in 1941, so he becomes a professor in 1939. In 1941, he decides he doesn't really like teaching, and he goes to work in a hospital as a porter. So he's someone who brings drugs around to patients, and he apparently advises patients to not take the drugs he gives them. And also, at this point, it was just ridiculous. Like the doctors and the nurses were, of course, aware of who he was. He's this famous, brilliant professor at Cambridge with, this incredible background. And now he's carrying around drugs at the hospital. So they're, I'm sure it was a very weird experience for them. In 1943, he decides to become a laboratory assistant instead. And this is still while he's receiving a paycheck from Cambridge for being a philosophy professor, but instead he's spending all this time helping out a meteorologist in a laboratory. Finally, in 1947, he actually quits his job as a professor to concentrate on his writing, and then dies in 1951. Reportedly, his last words were, "Tell them I've had a wonderful life." I don't know if that's true, but that is nice last words. I've had a wonderful life. By the way, this was a British hospital around World War II. So this is the sort of environment Wittgenstein would have been working in. And then after he dies, Philosophical Investigations is published based on his writings throughout this time. And then it's later ranked the best philosophical work of the 20th century. It's not quite as popular now. We'll talk about exactly what it says, but that was its reputation. So that's Wittgenstein's life. As I told you guys, it is the strangest, most interesting life of any philosopher I've ever heard of. It's so weird, and he goes through so many different. He really experiences several men's lives. I think that's a good way of putting it. He just really goes through everything. So in terms of his biography, Wittgenstein was incredibly rich, incredibly brilliant, and incredibly troubled. This led to a very weird life. The three of these combined means that Wittgenstein lived a very, very strange life. So, in terms of historical background, unfortunately, we're just gonna have to skip it. It's ironic. He lives at a way too exciting time for us to cover it. During the industrialization of Austria, World War I and World War II, how do we talk about all of that, especially considering he lives on both sides of the conflict? He lives in Austria and in England. His historical background is just too much, and so I'm just gonna have to assume you guys more or less know it. We'll cover World War I and World War II later in the course in more detail if it's not something you guys know a lot about. So let's just move on to his philosophy. So historical background, it's too complicated. We'll talk about it later. All right. So Wittgenstein's philosophy is pretty tricky. So before I go on to it, are there any questions about his biography, historical background, anything like that? All right, cool. Let's go on. So we can cover his philosophy through his two great works, Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus and Philosophical Investigations, published during his life, published after he died. So first with Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus, it's really hard to understand. It's really hard for me to understand. It was really hard for people to understand it when it was written. People have debated it a ton. I'm going to try to explain it my own way and see if it makes sense to you guys. Because I really don't think I can explain it like we tried to explain Kant or Socrates or whoever else, because it's a tricky work. So I want you guys to bear with me, to come with me as I try to explain it my way. So I want you guys to pretend you're captured by an alien. And this alien, this Martian, he needs you to be his reporter. He needs you to tell him what you see. So he sends you to Paris, right above the Eiffel Tower. And you look down at the tourists, the cars, and the tower. And your job is to write down everything so that this alien can understand it. So you're looking down, top the Eiffel Tower, and you're looking down, and this alien says, "Tell me everything you see. I need to use you as my eyes," right? So the first time this alien tells you this, you might write down something like this. You might write down there are cars and tourists. Someone's climbing up the Eiffel Tower. That's pretty weird. There's a man and a woman in love. So you say there are cars, there are tourists. It's a man and a woman in love. If you had sharper eyes, here on this bench, someone climbing up here. So when you write this down and you show it to the alien, but you realize you've made a mistake once you do this, um, because the alien has no idea what cars are. He has no idea what tourists are. And most importantly, you haven't really given him the reality of this situation. Uh, in other words, he can't think of this picture himself. He couldn't possibly know what this picture actually looks like based on what you just told him. So you're like, oh man, I made a mistake. Let me try again. Let me try again. So your second attempt, you think you're gonna do like a grid system. And you say, well, let's pretend the base of the tower is at point 0, 0. There's a car 10 meters up from the base of the Eiffel Tower at 0, 10, which is traveling at 20 kilometers per hour. A car is a metal object with 4 wheels and an engine. And you're doing this all on a grid like this here, right? So you might say this is 0, 0, and you say what's here, what's here, what's here, and you think you can do all of this, and you think this is the solution. So you've divided this up in a grid, and you say this is here, this is here, this is here, this is here, and you think that's the solution. So the alien's like, okay, I understand better now. But I still have a problem. I don't know what wheels are. And now you're getting frustrated. You're like, oh, like you're like, as soon as I tell you that wheels are rubber and metal, you're just gonna want to know what rubber and metal are. This is going to go on forever. Then you're gonna want to know what an engine is. Then you're gonna want to know what metal is. Like this is going to go on forever. I'm never going to be able to like stop explaining things to you. So you tell the alien that you have a better idea. Instead of doing this whole grid system, you tell the alien, hey, write down all of the facts that you know. Write down everything that you know, everything that could be true, and I'll cross out the ones that aren't true. Then you'll know the picture and I can go home. So this is a bit of a hard leap, I know, but instead of writing down stuff like this in a grid and writing down what you know, you tell the alien, write down everything that he knows. He should write down everything that he knows, and you'll tell him what he knows that isn't true about this situation. So if he writes down everything that could be true about this situation, and you tell him everything that isn't actually true, he'll get the picture. So are you guys with me so far? Does this all make sense so far? All right, good. So next you're on to your third attempt. So for your third attempt, the alien writes down every fact that he can think of. Then you cross out the ones that aren't true. He starts off with the basic facts. There is oxygen. Connects them to make more complicated facts. There's a dog breathing oxygen, and it fits in with his understanding. So before, he knew there might have been oxygen. And it turns out he knew there might have been a dog because he knew what dogs were. Now he knows definitely that there is a dog breathing oxygen somewhere in this picture. And he does that with everything. Everything is going to be built up from the most basic things he knows to complex things. He knew there might have been, a person somewhere in this picture, and now he knows there's a person here, 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 and here. All right. So he's written down everything he knows. You've crossed out everything else. He understands it because he's the one who wrote it. So now, given that he has this big list of things now which are true and things that are false, he plugs it into his computer. And his magic computer spits out a moving video that's exactly as you remember the Eiffel Tower on that day. You don't know if that's actually how the Eiffel Tower was, but that's definitely how you remember it. So remember, you don't have this picture, all you have is your memory of this picture. So you don't know if this video is how it is, but you know it's how you remember it. So you and the alien are both happy. You start to leave, but the alien tells you to wait. He remembers you said that there's a man and a woman in love. And in your first attempt, you said there's a man and a woman in love. And he's not sure if he captured it. He's like, I'm not sure if I really put love in the video. So you're like, okay, well, let's see what you put into your computer, and I'll see how it works. So you're gonna look at his list of facts again, and you're gonna try to cross things out so that you can explain love. And you look at this list of facts for a really long time, but you can't figure it out. No matter what you cross off on this list, you can't get down to a man and a woman being in love. You can't figure out how to cross out facts to make that clear. So you tell the alien, sorry, this isn't gonna work. And the alien says, okay, I understand. I understand it's not perfect. And you say, okay. So before you leave, the alien asks you to double check his video and to make sure it's okay. And so this time, in order to double check your video, you ask if you can take it with you to the Eiffel Tower itself. And he says, okay, yeah, sure. So you go to the Eiffel Tower, and you look down and back at the video. And that's when you realize the video is exactly how it appears in your mind, but how it appears in your mind isn't identical to how it appears on the ground. So when you look at this scene and you shut your eyes and you imagine it, like that's not the same thing. You don't see the same thing as when you open your eyes and when you see it. So you don't really know how to fix this though, because you've only can tell the alien what it looks like in your mind. You can't tell him what it actually looks like in the ground, right? You can only tell him what it looks like in your mind. So you go back and you tell the alien, yeah, the video is as good as it's gonna get, and you go on with your life. So now Wittgenstein says that this process is how every language works. We state facts which correspond to a reality in the world. And when we try to go outside of that reality of the world, we end up failing. Our language isn't good enough. Our language can't be good enough. So that's the end of the analogy. Before I go on to the way Wittgenstein actually put this in Tracticus, does my analogy make sense to everyone? And so everyone's okay for me to move on to what Wittgenstein actually said. So what's the difference between reality and the remembered? Let's essentially look at this. Look at this picture. There's a lot of stuff going on in this picture. So when you try to remember it, you're not going to be able to remember this in all of the detail that you can actually see, right? What you remember, your picture of this is going to be a simplification of what's actually going on. And this is a still picture. If this was something you were actually looking at and people were moving around, your memory of it would be even more simple than what it actually is. Does that make sense? All right, great. So this ends the analogy. So let's cover how Wittgenstein put it. Yeah, your memory can't copy the whole reality. Yeah. So let's look at how Wittgenstein put it, and we'll see exactly why people found it so tricky. So the way Wittgenstein put it is he had 7 basic propositions for all of Tracticus. So here are the first 5. So his first proposition is the world is everything that is the case. So what that means is the world consists of everything that is both true and can be said to be true. So here he's defining the world. The world is everything that is true and also that can be said to be true. So what is the case? A fact is the existence of states of affairs. And he says, so when I say everything that's true, I mean everything that's true right now, but doesn't have to be true. So it's true, but it's not necessarily true. So now defining, talking about facts, a logical picture of facts is a thought. So our thoughts are an attempt to make logical sense out of what's true. All right. So we've defined the world, we've defined the case, and now we've defined thoughts. Thoughts are an attempt to make logical sense out of what's true. A thought is a proposition with a sense. So each thought is a true or false claim about the world. So everything you think is either true or false, and it's about the case, right? It's about things that are both true and can be said to be true. Five, a proposition is a truth function of elementary propositions. An elementary proposition is a truth function of itself. So if you make a true or false claim about the world, it's composed of smaller true or false claims about the world. So if you make the claim that Socrates was a man and had white hair, your smaller true and false claims are Socrates was a man and Socrates had a white hair. And then even smaller than that is Socrates was, so that he existed. In Wittgenstein, that says that's everything. Everything is built up of those elementary true or false claims. So The general form of a proposition is the general form of a truth function, which is, I'm actually not quite sure how to read this set notation. It doesn't really matter. This is the general form of a proposition. So he says, when you make a claim about the world, your claim is a group of every possible claim, and then you negate the ones you don't believe to make up your actual claim. So there's a limited world of what is true or false. It's bounded. It's bounded by every possible claim that you can make about the world. Then his last one is whereof one cannot speak, thereof one must be silent. So if you can't put what you're trying to say into a claim format, if you can't put what you're trying to say into a true or false proposition about the world, then there's no point in talking about it. You won't get anywhere. So another part of this is you can't argue about the structure of language itself, its relation to reality, or any of the building blocks of the language, or else your arguments won't make sense. This is Wittgenstein's philosophy, which is quite complicated. So we start off, we say the world, everything that's true can be said to be true. What's true is that some things exist now which don't have to exist. When we think about things, we try to make logical sense of what's true. Each thought is a true or false claim about the world. A true or false claim about the world is made up of smaller true or false claims. So you start off with this big true or false claim. Socrates was a man with white hair. You get to smaller true or false claims. Socrates was a man and Socrates had white hair. And then you get to your smallest true or false claim. Socrates was. So that's rule 5. Rule 6 is when you make a claim, you start off with every possible claim, and then you negate the ones you don't believe to make up your actual claim. And that's how you build it up. So it's not that you build up. So when you make this claim about Socrates was a man and had white hair, that's you saying that everything else that could possibly be true about the world, you're saying that's not true. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying right now is just Socrates was a man and had white hair. And you are saying that by saying, I'm not, the way you say that is by saying nothing, I'm not claiming anything else right now. What I'm claiming right now is Socrates was a man and had white hair. And because of that, because you start by specifically identifying what you're not claiming, that means that there's a limited amount of things you can actually claim. So anything outside that limited amount of things that you can claim, you can't talk about. I mean, you can, but you're not going to get anywhere. You won't understand it. All right. So I know this is difficult. Do you guys get this so far? All right. So a big controversy over all of this is Russell's claim in the introduction of Tracticus. And this is what gets Wittgenstein so mad. So Russell claims Wittgenstein meant this as a statement for what a logically perfect language should be. Most followers of Wittgenstein assume this is a statement about what each language actually is. So Russell took this as, if you wanted to make a logically perfect language, you would make it like this. You would say the only things you can say are in these forms of true or false claims, which build up. Followers of Wittgenstein, on the other hand, assumed Wittgenstein was describing how languages actually are. It would have helped if Wittgenstein explained himself, but he never did. Wittgenstein was furious at Russell, tried to remove his introduction from the book, but wouldn't explain what he actually meant and just said, everyone misunderstands me, no one gets what I'm trying to say. So he's pretty unhelpful in terms of understanding it. To my mind, claiming that this is what every language actually is really an impossible claim because it's ignoring the complexity of language. And Wittgenstein himself will admit this later. So Russell's idea that this is a logically perfect language makes way more sense. That's way more defensible. If Wittgenstein is trying to say this is what a logically perfect language would be, that makes a lot of sense. If Wittgenstein is trying to say this is what language is, that doesn't make sense because we say things all the time that aren't true or false claims, right? Like if I say, I don't know, if I say I like vanilla ice cream, I'm not making a true or false claim. I'm just saying this is what I like. I like vanilla ice cream. It tastes good. So, yeah. All right. So I think we should take a 5-minute break before we go on to philosophical investigations, the next half of Wittgenstein's philosophy. So let's 5-minute break. If you guys have any questions, put them in QQ chat. I'll answer them when they get back. And I will be right back at 10:05 on my clock. All right. All right. So yeah, if you guys have any questions about what we just covered, now would be a good time to ask them. Or just complaints about how complicated Wittgenstein is. That would also be a good time for complaints about how complicated Wittgenstein is. Or on the other hand, how is everybody doing? Doing good? All right, 10:05. Everyone ready to begin again? And yes, uh, language is conveying your picture of the world to others. Yep, and that was my analogy with the alien as you're conveying your picture to other people. Um, yeah, he's a difficult philosopher. Um, so if you guys find it hard to understand um, uh, uh, what Wittgenstein actually said, in my analogy, the alien, what occurred between you and the alien is what occurs in language in general. We have this picture in our mind that we're trying to communicate to other people. And the way we do that is we build up by the limited amount of true or false claims about the world. We build it up from this limited amount of facts. And that's how we convey our picture of the world to other people. So that's Wittgenstein's essential point. And like if what you're trying to say isn't contained in that small amount or in that limited amount of true or false claims, then you won't be able to say it. Just like if you were trying to describe this picture of a man and woman in love to an alien, you wouldn't be able to communicate it because you can't build it up from the facts that he knows. So yeah. So if you guys have trouble with what Wittgenstein says, stick with my analogy. It's supposed to be about how language works for all of us. We're all trying to describe the Eiffel Tower to aliens. All right. So everyone can hear me, see my screen. Oh, I remember. Daja ng kandao will the screen, right? I think that's right. I know my accent is really terrible, so I apologize for that. Um, yeah, yeah, I'm actually Chinese native. Yeah, I get mistaken for an American a lot, but I'm actually uh, uh, 我是中国人. But yeah. Okay, so philosophy, part 2. So philosophical investigations is published after Wittgenstein's death, and it blows up everything that Tracticus said, which I've represented here with cartoon bang. By the way, in the process of blowing up everything that Tracticus says, Wittgenstein really, really annoys Russell, who claims that Wittgenstein had given up on philosophy. So just everything that Wittgenstein says after this, Russell hated, but a lot of other people really, really liked. It was, again, voted one of the most, it was voted the most important philosophical book of the 20th century. So now he's blown up everything, and now he starts fresh. He starts with a completely different belief. So his new belief is that the meaning of a word is its use in the language, rather than any fact that it represents. So his new meaning is that before he said there is a cat was your attempt to convey your mental picture of a cat which exists in the world. So if you told your friend or you told an alien there is a cat, you have a picture in your mind and you're trying to convey it to your friend or to this alien. Now, Wittgenstein is saying, if you say there is a cat, it only means whatever it means in the conversation. So because of that, any attempts we make at a generalization of a word or rules about a sentence, they're necessarily misguided. There's only use. If you want to figure out what a word means, don't think about what the word means. You need to listen to a bunch of conversations. So, he's saying don't think about words, don't think about sentences, just listen to conversations. That's what a word can mean. And we use words for a lot of things. As Wittgenstein puts it, we have a lot of language games. So it doesn't make sense to come up with general rules. Wittgenstein provides an incredibly long list of language games. And here's his list. We use language for reporting an event, speculating about an event, forming and testing a hypothesis, making up a story, reading a story, play acting, singing, riddles, joking, translating, asking, thanking. He says there's a bunch of different ways we can use language. So it doesn't make sense to come up with any rules for it. So in the same way, trying to understand rules for language is also a pointless task. There are rules, but there's no way of saying what really counts as following a rule or what grounds a rule is valid. So I don't really understand this personally. I think it's a mistake. Wittgenstein uses the example of math for this. And he says, there's no way of saying math is wrong or math is invalid. Because what if someone says 2 + 3 = 6? But to me, that doesn't make sense because it seems super obvious that there are rules in math. And it's clear when someone doesn't follow a rule in math. So I don't get what Wittgenstein, or I don't agree with Wittgenstein when he says there's no way of saying what counts as following a rule. Like if you say 2 + 3 = 6, you're obviously not following the rules of addition. If you say 2 plus 3 equals 5, you are. So this is a really debated statement. But Wittgenstein said, nope, no way of saying what counts as following a rule, no way of saying what grounds a rule is valid, or on what grounds a rule is valid. So part of a language being defined by use is that a language needs at least two people. You don't need language to talk to yourself, so there's no use of language with just yourself. So he said, a language with only one speaker is not really a language. Again, I don't know what Wittgenstein would think about people who talk to themselves. Like if you're like trying to psych yourself up before a run and you're like, you know, oh man, I really gotta finish this one. I really gotta go 5 kilometers on this one. I don't know exactly what he would think of that. Wittgenstein claimed that when we think that we're thinking with language, but really we're thinking without language and using language after the fact. That would be Wittgenstein's answer. Is you think that you're thinking with language, but you're really just using language for what you've already thought. That's his answer. I'm not saying I agree with it, but that would be his answer. So grammar exists only so we can understand each other. Everyone agrees on the same rules of grammar, which is why the same sentence means the same thing to two people. But it's pointless to analyze grammar beyond that or try to use it to prove a point. So Wittgenstein, remember Kant said philosophical paradoxes are because we were trying to use intuitive understandings beyond the way we should be using them. Wittgenstein says philosophical paradoxes are because of grammar. So Wittgenstein used the example, it's grammatically correct to say, I know what I am thinking. Or sorry, it's grammatically incorrect to say, I know what I am thinking. It's grammatically incorrect or correct to say, I know what you are thinking. So it's incorrect to say, I know what I am thinking. It's correct to say, I know what you are thinking. And Wittgenstein says that doesn't actually tell you anything about knowing or thinking. You're just analyzing sentences. You're just saying what is true in grammar. You're not saying anything about what's true in the real world, or even what's true in someone's mind. So the weirdest part about philosophical investigations is the way it's written. Tracticus is a formal analytic argument. It has propositions and it has sub-propositions, and he proves its propositions. Investigations, which we'll read ourselves, is written as thought experiments. And there are questions and answers from observers sprinkled throughout. It's quite weird. We'll read it. So this is Wittgenstein part 2. He gets tired of a logically perfect language, and he blows it up, and he says, no point in analyzing language. Language is only something people use to communicate. Trying to use philosophy to understand language or trying to use language to understand philosophy is totally useless. And he says, many philosophers have wasted a lot of time by doing this. So, philosophy. So, he had two belief systems. The first was language is a logical picture of the world, and that's all it does, is it presents a logical picture of the world. The second said language is too complex to categorize. So you guys can see how these are completely opposed to each other. One says this is what language is, the other says it's impossible to say what language is. So that's Wittgenstein. Now let's talk about background philosophy. So the two most important influences on Wittgenstein were Russell and Frege, or both of whom were Wittgenstein's mentors. Frege, Russell, I don't know exactly the German way of putting it. I think it's Frege, but again, I don't speak German. He doesn't actually seem that interested in older philosophy, and it's hard to tell if he ever even read Aristotle. His students at Cambridge, when he was, again, a philosophy professor at Cambridge, his graduate students realized that whenever they would reference Aristotle or some famous philosopher or Socrates or someone like that, Wittgenstein would have no idea what they were talking about. So they came to the conclusion that Wittgenstein just never read older philosophy. He was only interested in the philosophy that was being done during his time. So talking about Gottlieb Frege first, so he was Wittgenstein's mentor in pure mathematics. He's a very hard philosopher to explain briefly, as you'd expect by pure mathematics. So I'm not going to explain what he did. I'm going to explain what he was trying to do. So he developed a formal mathematical way of expressing logic. So he wrote references and a few lines of equations. Aristotle had to write paragraphs of words to write, and it made the inference absolute. So remember, Kant said, was it Kant or Hume? One of them said, you shouldn't ever use, mathematicians think they can come into philosophy, philosophers think they can come into mathematics, and them realize that it's a terrible idea. Frege says, Kant, you're wrong, and he uses math to talk about philosophy. So this is Frege's effort. Use math to talk about philosophy. So then, of course, they think, well, there's an opportunity here to do the opposite. What if we use logic to talk about math? What if instead of saying 1 + 1 = 2, there's some way to put that in a logical form? So Frege tried, but it didn't work out too well. So it was left to Bertrand Russell and Alfred Whitehead, Russell's mentor, to make the real effort. So let's talk about Bertrand Russell. You've been reading him for a while now, or at least you should have been if you've been doing the pre-reading, which I really hope you have. So I think you can tell the way he thinks about philosophy from his work. He wanted philosophy to work, and he wanted it to tell truth. And he had no patience for softness, mysticism, or a lack of clarity. For him, philosophy was something that did work for you. Philosophy told truth. That was it. It didn't reveal to you the mysteries of the world or make you appreciate life. Bertrand Russell was like, philosophy, the point of it is to tell the truth and to let us know what the truth is. So Russell's greatest philosophical work was the massive Principia Mathematica, written with Alfred Whitehead, which attempted to explain all of mathematics using Frege's logic. So given that, you can see he'd respect Wittgenstein's Tracticus as a similar sort of effort, trying to explain all of language logically, or at least develop a logical form of language. So he was like, this makes sense. I tried to explain mathematics with logic. my student would try to explain language with logic. That makes sense. So you understand where Russell's coming from. So in terms of explaining mathematics using logic, very famously in Principia Mathematica, it takes several hundred pages to prove that 1 + 1 = 2. Because he doesn't want to make any assumptions, he tries to say from the bare minimum, can we prove 1 + 1 = 2? And it takes him several hundred pages. Ultimately, Principia Mathematica, although an enormous and impressive effort, fails because Kurt Gödel proves the system can be proved within itself. So mathematics can't be proved logically because you can't prove mathematics within the system of mathematics. So logic doesn't apply. So let's talk about Wittgenstein as Frege and Russell. So at first, he appreciates Frege and Russell. So his work on language in Tracticus is an attempt to make it as logical as it already existed without Frege's efforts to come up with a new form of language. So his first attempt was like, I'm going to see if I can make language logical without having to come up with a new form of language, new letters, new words. I'm just going to see if I can make it logical in itself. Or on the other hand, it might have been an attempt to explain that language was already logical. So Frege was wasting his time. He didn't need to use math to explain philosophy. Language was already logical enough. But then, after Tracticus, Wittgenstein realizes the limitations of language, philosophy, and logic, and he gets very frustrated. He takes a completely different path, claiming that language would never be logical or even understood. So, background to philosophy, Russell and Frege's attempts to create a mathematical basis for logic and a logical foundation for mathematics. All right. So this is our background to philosophy. Before we go on to reading philosophical investigations, are there any questions?有问题吗？好不好？ All right. 大家觉得清楚了吗？啊，非常好了。All right. On to philosophical investigations. So our last question is always, how did Wittgenstein argue? So Investigations was published in 1953 after Wittgenstein's death, although it's believed he could have published it before then if he had really wanted to. It was both very controversial and very popular when it was published. Russell and his followers absolutely hated it. They thought it was a big step backwards, leaving all questions to the community and abandoning philosophy altogether. However, in Cambridge, it was a revelation. So where Wittgenstein was a professor, people thought it was unbelievably brilliant. This was true. It got more and more popular, like until probably the 70s, and everyone loved it. And then people stopped being so impressed with it, and at the current moment, it's pretty much abandoned. People know of it, people think it's interesting, but no one really follows it anymore the same way they did in the 70s. Very much a fact. So, all right. So we ready to go on? All right, cool. So how does one use words? Well, Wittgenstein tells us we use it as categories for practical purposes. Now think of the following use of language. I send someone shopping. I give him a slip marked 5 red apples. Takes the slip to the shopkeeper, who opens the drawer marked apples. Then he takes up the word red in a table and finds a color sample opposite it. Then he says the series of cardinal numbers. I assume that he knows them by heart, up to the word 5. And for each number, he takes an apple of the same color as the sample out of the jar. It is in this and in similar ways that one operates with words. But how does he know where and how he is to look up the word red, what he is to do with the word 5? Well, I assume that he acts as I have described. Explanations come to an end somewhere. Well, what is the meaning of the word 5? No such thing was in question here, only how the word 5 is used. So dashes here seem to represent separate thoughts. So when we use dash up to the word 5, dash, it is in this, dash, but how does he know? It seems to represent separate thoughts, but this is how Wittgenstein wrote this. So he doesn't explain what exactly he means by these dashes. It's just, well, it's just how we're given. So in terms of a simple English translation, if we go to a store and we ask for 5 red apples, the shopkeeper knows in a practical sense what to do. Nothing else matters. We don't need to think about anything else, what 5 or red or apples means. He knows in a practical sense how to give us 5 red apples. So in terms of commentary on this, it's interesting to compare this to Plato and Aristotle, who thought that categories were some sort of real knowledge about the world. You know, Plato has this idea of forms as like, you know, everything is imitating the perfect whatever, the perfect apple, the perfect red. Aristotle, you know, says, what is this category? What do we know from these categories? Wittgenstein, on the other hand, just says, this is how we interact in the world. This is how it works. There's nothing more to be said about this, and there's nothing more to be gained from talking about this. So, next, Wittgenstein claims that St. Augustine, who remember we covered in terms of his influence on Thomas Aquinas, but Wittgenstein claims St. Augustine claims all language was just to directly represent meaning. The purpose of language was to represent meaning. And he says that's true, but only in a limited sense. Augustine, we might say, does describe a system of communication, only not everything that we call language is in the system. One has to say this in many cases where the question arises, is this an appropriate description or not? The answer is yes, it is appropriate, but only for this narrowly circumscribed region, not for the whole of what you're claiming to describe. It is as if someone were to say a game consists in moving objects about on a surface according to certain rules. We replied, you seem to be thinking of board games, but there are others. You can make your definition correct by expressly restricting it to those games. So Wittgenstein says this common definition of language, that language represents meaning, it's true, but it's only for a limited view of language. But if you really want to understand language, you have to understand language in all the ways it's used. It's the same thing as if you tried to describe all games by just talking about board games. You wouldn't understand all games, and you would have to know that you're not understanding all games. So in terms of commentary on this, it does seem like Wittgenstein's argument is circular here, because he's making an argument about language by saying it'd be silly if someone made a certain statement. We're using the tool to examine itself. I think earlier Wittgenstein would have been much stricter about this, wouldn't have allowed us to use language to examine language, especially because, you know, Wittgenstein says all these things about, oh, we can't really understand the use of language, we can't really say improper use of language. But here, Wittgenstein is saying this is an improper use of language. So it's circular, or at least it's contradictory. But you know, it is, this is later Wittgenstein. Sophie, I don't quite understand your question. Game is no rule. He says, he's saying the definition of he's saying this is a limited definition of language. That's his essential claim here, is just this is a limited definition of language, that language represents meaning. Says language can be used for other things as well as just representing meaning. All right. Yeah, I'm not sure if that answers your question or not. But let's go on. So Wittgenstein says next, the reason why it's not useful to say that language represents meaning is because it's not useful to try to figure out what words mean. So, and his way of explaining this is, imagine someone saying all tools serve to modify something. Thus, the hammer modifies the position of the nail, the saw, the shape of the board, and so on. What is modified by the rule? The glue pot, the nails, knowledge of a thing's length, the temperature of the glue, and the solidity of the box. Would anything be gained by this assimilation of expressions? So there's no practical use to figuring out what words mean, just as you wouldn't be able to better able to understand tools if you have this like formal definition of how they work. So he says there's no practical use of like defining oh, the hammer modifies the position of the nail. You know, there's not really a great point to this. Um, you know, you're not better able to use a hammer because you've said that or because someone has told you that. So this is true in the limited extent that Wittgenstein describes as my commentary on this. So this is a very formal and not very useful way of describing them. However, there is a useful way of describing things that does allow us to use them better. So, for instance, I have here a bunch of wood joints. This is when you use these different wood joints, in which cases, and that would, if someone, no pun intended, that would tell you how to use these better if you were a carpenter. This is pretty similar to Wittgenstein's breakdown of the operations of the tool. As you say when to use it, when not to use it, how to use it. So there's a useful way of describing tools. So I think Wittgenstein, again, he has a point here, but he sort of oversteps it. He's a little sloppy here because he's arguing in a very strange manner. He's a little sloppy with his arguments. But let's go on and see where this language arguments about language go. So Wittgenstein, his main example throughout all of this has been of a very simplified language of his men on a construction site yelling out wood or hammer. And he says that's not what languages really are. So someone might be bothered by Wittgenstein using that as his main example. And this is Wittgenstein's response to people claiming he hasn't really captured the complexities of language. He says, do not be troubled by the fact that languages 2 and 8, this is based on something he said before, don't have to worry about it, consist only of orders. If you want to say that this shows them to be incomplete, ask yourself whether our language is complete. Whether it is so before the symbolism of chemistry and the notation of the infinitesimal calculus were incorporated in it, for these are, so to speak, suburbs of our language. How many houses or streets does it take before a town begins to be a town? Language can be seen as an ancient city, a maze of little streets and squares, of old and new houses, and of houses with additions from various periods. It is surrounded by a multitude of new boroughs with straight regular streets and uniform houses. So he says, don't be bothered if you think his examples are too simple or if his examples don't capture the complexity of actual language. And he says that's because language is always going to be incomplete. New notations are being added all the time. Calculus was added, chemistry was added. And we're not saying that English is incomplete just because we know that in the future some new notations are going to be added. You know, English still exists. And he uses as his analogy here, our language is like a city. We have old parts and new parts. We have very regular old parts, very irregular new parts. Very regular old parts, very irregular old parts. So it's all like a mess of things combined. So don't worry too much about it. So I think this is an interesting point on Wittgenstein's part. I'd want to ask if these are really new sorts of uses of language rather than new terms or words. Like, this is definitely new terms, and these are definitely new words, but is this really a new use of language? Wittgenstein, of course, would say that this question is meaningless, that there's no difference in saying, and then new terms, new words, new uses, all of this is just part of language as a whole. Maybe he's right on this. I don't think there's a clear and easy way to say this is notation and this is language. It's not a clear distinction. All right. There are no questions. Let's keep going. So how do we communicate meaning, though? How do we actually, we know that language isn't just communicating meaning, but that's certainly a big part of it, trying to explain to the other person the picture in our head. So how do we do it? Well, Wittgenstein says it's not really obvious. Look, think about this construction site. If you shout slab, you really mean bring me a slab. But how do you do this? How do you mean that while you say slab? Do you say the unshortened sentence to yourself? And why should I translate the call slab into a different expression in order to say what someone means by it? If they mean the same thing, why should I not say when he says slab, he means slab? Again, if you can mean bring me the slab, why should you not be able to mean slab? When I call slab, then what I want is that he should bring me a slab. So this is a slab, by the way, like this concrete, almost looks like a mattress, like it's just a concrete rectangle, right? So to translate this, Wittgenstein says, calling out slab, so the name of this, calling out slab is the same as saying bring me a slab, and it's the same as saying I want someone to bring me a slab. How are the three related? Why does slab bring me a slab and I want someone to bring me a slab? Why are they all the same? Well, there's nothing mysterious according to Wittgenstein. They just all mean the same thing. If you analyze this more, you'll confuse yourself and not learn anything. So he just says, don't analyze this anymore. There's no point in it. So in my imagination, this is the point when Russell, probably reading this, got really, really mad. I can understand him saying that this analysis is mistaken, but I don't understand why he says this means that our analysis stops here. I don't understand why he says this is where our analysis stops. There's nothing more to be said here. It seems there could be something in psychology, but Wittgenstein just says, nope, stop asking questions. So what's the relation of all this to philosophy? We've talked a lot about language, but Wittgenstein is a philosopher. So why has he written this? Well, Wittgenstein says, this is why philosophy has been going down the wrong path. This is why everything is so confused. And here he attacks Russell's mentor directly. He talks Frege. Frege's idea that every assertion contains an assumption, which is the thing that asserted, really rests on the possibility found in our language of writing every statement in the form. It is asserted that such and such is the case. But that such and such is the case is not a sentence in our language. So far, it is not a move in the language game. By right not, it is asserted that, but it is asserted, such and such is the case. The words it is asserted simply becomes superfluous. So to translate this into simple English, Wittgenstein says Frege is wrong. Because when Frege says, this is what people mean, Wittgenstein says, no, it isn't. That's not what people really mean. So this is a strange objection on the point of Wittgenstein. To me, it just seems like using Wittgenstein's own terms, language games, seems like they're playing different language games. Um, so Frege trying to put things logically. He's trying to make a logical construction, or make sense of things logically. He's not trying to read people's minds. So Wittgenstein's reasoning against him, that this isn't really what people mean, doesn't seem like it's a fair point. So Wittgenstein here then attacks his own beliefs. So he's attacked his mentor's beliefs, now he attacks his own beliefs. He says, he attacks atomic facts, which are, remember, the most basic things you can put together to make a complex representation. So our atomic fact from Socrates was a man and had white hair. One of our atomic facts was Socrates was. So we name things and then we can talk about them, can refer to them in talk. As if we did next were given with the mere act of naming, as if there were only one thing called talking about a thing. Whereas in fact, we do the most various things with our sentences. Think of the exclamations alone with their completely different functions. Water, away, ow, help, find, no. Are you inclined still to call these words names of objects? So he's saying when our atomic fact was Socrates was, we needed to name Socrates in order to say that. So Wittgenstein says, it doesn't make sense to identify that as a separate practice. We didn't name Socrates and then talk about him. We didn't say name Socrates and then say Socrates was. It's just all part of the same complex language game. So I agree with Wittgenstein here, but I think it's ironic that his issue would have been solved if he had agreed with Russell that his ideas were about how a logical language should be rather than how it is. I don't think it was ever a reasonable thing to say that when we say Socrates was, what we're trying to do is name Socrates and then say he was. That was never a reasonable interpretation. The reasonable interpretation was that would be a logical way of constructing language. All right. This is my favorite picture, by the way. So physical objects may be used in the language game, but only as references. This is the only case in which it matters whether or not something exists for a speech to make sense. It doesn't matter if Spider-Man exists. We can say Spider-Man is fat, and that makes sense because Spider-Man is being represented. However, imagine if we kept a single blue square in Paris as the ultimate referent to that which is blue. So it normally doesn't matter if something exists, if we're trying to convey language, whatever, when we talk about it. Because if we just say Spider-Man is fat, it's a meaningful sentence, or at the very least, it's an understandable sentence, even though Spider-Man doesn't exist. Because Spider-Man is being represented. Spider-Man doesn't actually exist, but we still know what it's like for Spider-Man to be fat. But what if we kept a single blue square in Paris as the ultimate referent for that which is blue? So that's our sort of like Hume here. We have this one blue square, and that's what blue is. This is what blue is. We can put it like this. This sample is an instrument of the language used in descriptions of color. This language game, it is not something that is represented, but it is a means of representation. Just this goes for an element in language game. When we name it by uttering the word R, this gives this object a role in our language game. It is now a means of representation. And to say if it did not exist, it could have no name, It's to say as much and as little as this thing did not exist, we could not use it in our language game. So basically we're saying if this blue square is the ultimate referent for blue, we're no longer representing it when we say blue. When we try to represent the blue sky by using the words blue sky, we represent the concept of Spider-Man by saying Spider-Man. But instead, we could actually use a physical object as the representation itself. And we could name it R, and that would be the representation. And that'd be interesting because if it disappeared, if R disappeared, we'd no longer be able to use it in our language game. And this actually helps explain variables, because you can use variables to represent things. So here we're using R to represent this blue square, and it matters if the term behind the variable exists. So if this term disappears, if this blue square disappears, R disappears. R no longer has any meaning, it disappears. And this is sort of cool. This is actually pretty relevant to computer science. You guys have studied programming, this idea of pointers and whatever. So I think this is actually a pretty cool idea on the part of Wittgenstein. But on the whole, that's all we're going to cover of philosophical investigations, because I imagine you guys are pretty tired. I'm pretty tired. To generalize, Wittgenstein argued through clever thought experiments and examples. This was the way he argued in philosophical investigations, but it's pretty sloppy. There are a lot of clever thought experiments. There are a lot of clever examples, but he's not very precise with his language in philosophical investigations. Meanwhile, he was very deductive and analytic in Tracticus. All right. As my conclusion, so we're done. That's all the investigations we'll read. I think you get the gist of it. You get the idea. Tracticus is an undeniable achievement. It makes sense if you assume it's describing a logically perfect language rather than language itself. And then you get a really interesting idea about the limits and purposes of logic. Philosophical investigations, on the other hand, I'm not quite as impressed with. I appreciate the idea behind it, especially when we think we're arguing over philosophy, but really we're arguing over language. So I think that's useful when you're wondering, am I arguing about philosophy or am I arguing about language? It makes these big claims and doesn't back them up that well. And that's sort of interesting, because in the end, for both of his big works, he runs into trouble when he tries to make statements about how language actually is. That's an empirical claim. You need evidence in the world. And that's not something Wittgenstein can really have the data for, although of course he would disagree. So next time we're going to finish how to think, and we're going to also be officially done with half the course, which is pretty exciting. And we're going to cover Karl Popper. And Karl Popper is concerned about something completely different. He's living at the same time as Wittgenstein. He hates Wittgenstein. He thinks he's worried about totally the wrong things. Karl Popper is going to go back to David Hume, and he's going to save science from David Hume. So be prepared for that, for Karl Popper coming in and saving science. All right. So that is everything we have for today. I know that was a tough lesson. It's tough for me. I hope you guys understood it. And yeah. As always, thank you for listening. Thank you for being a great audience. And I will stick around for a couple minutes, answer some questions. So what characteristics does a logically perfect language have? Presumably, a logically perfect language would be something where you'd say a sentence and it would be true or false, and also you would say a sentence and it would mean the same thing to everyone, right? So I would say there's a, you know, uh, the president of America is Barack Obama. That would mean the same thing to everyone. Everyone who heard that and knew English would be, okay, I know what he's trying to say. And they would be able to say conclusively whether what I was saying was true or false. And I too would be able to say something true or false. Um, is our language like our physical senses, which is a premise for us to understand the world? Um, I wouldn't. It's an interesting idea. I'm not sure I would agree with that. Wittgenstein certainly wouldn't. He would say we understand the world first and then use language to communicate our understanding of the world to other people. So he wouldn't say we understand the world through language. Um, but he would, it wasn't something he was concerned with, but I think he would certainly think we understand the world through our physical senses. All right, good question though. All right, it's 11, no problem. So it's 11 o'clock. Yeah, you guys have Wittgenstein homework. I'll post up homework and answers on Reddit so you guys can see a good way to answer questions. And yeah, as always, thank you very much. Bye bye. Have a good night.